When Noah got drunk, was that because the potency increased during the deluge?
Or because he's been on a ship for a year and hasn't had any alcohol in his system, or just
found found a thing,
found something that he didn't
found something at the back of
know
the ark,
about.
like, oh, I forgot about this. What's happening? No, it's an interesting question, actually. If you look at things like yeast and the production of alcohol, with things like grapes, the yeast is found naturally on the grapes, and so as soon as you start to mash your grapes and turn it into juice, there's very little you can do to stop it from producing alcohol. You have to actually artificially sterilize it in order to produce grape juice, which wasn't really perfected until the 1800s, early 1900s. So as soon as you get juice from grapes, you're going to start to turn it into alcohol in some way. The content of alcohol is based on the content of sugar, so maybe that has something to do with it. You'll often find that if you start growing stuff in a climate which is unusual for that plant, or if a sudden climate change happens, you can kind of blanch the plant, force it into producing sugars at a higher quantity more quickly. So maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe the sugar content was not as high before the flood, and now in a new world you're forcing a higher sugar content, which is going to produce more alcohol. I'm just speculating here, right?
The cooler environment, usually they put up more sugars.
Yeah.
And so if he's now at a very higher elevation and he's not, that didn't exist before the flood, well, it could very likely have a much higher sugar content than he was used to.
And maybe it could be more to do with the way that, also you've got to bear in mind that when God created, there was a tending of the garden for sure. But you've got to remember that everything was good to eat. At this point, everything, right? So you could have plucked any leaf you want, any fruit you wanted, whatever, and eat it, and it's good for you. So what you wouldn't have to do, yes, you'd have to tend, but what you wouldn't have to do is produce stuff en masse. Get it out of your head of this kind of like mass production that we see in farming and stuff today that leads to a lot of problems with agriculture. And so before the flood, before you have a mechanism for major climate change, yes, you have 1,500 years, 14 to 1,500 years approximately of the fall happening, right? Degeneration. But you don't have a major mechanism for climate change. So yes, the plants are slowly going downhill, but there's not that acceleration factor. So the majority of stuff is going to be good to eat. So you're not going to have to work that hard to get your food. You're not going to have to mass produce food in farms and so on and so forth. Then you have the flood, and then you have Noah coming off of the flood and settling in the land of Shinar. And he settles, and I think it's in Genesis 9, it says that he planted a vineyard. So you're now producing a large quantity of these grapes. And if you are from a farming or gardening background, as I am, you'll know that you get to this kind of period in the sort of springtime, which we got to know as the hungry period, because your garden's not producing anything, right? So what do you do to get through the hungry period? You grow extra through the summer and the autumn. You have a harvest period where you harvest all this stuff en masse, which you wouldn't have to have done in a good world or in a world where the climate was perfect. And then you're having to preserve that food in some way. Now with our modern things, we can freeze and, can and whatever. But in the past, you wouldn't have done that. You would have mashed, you would have bottled, you would have jarred, you would have dried, you would have salted, right? And so if you're growing a vineyard and it's mass producing, you're now mass producing these grapes, which only are going to fruit at a certain time of year, unlike all the year round, like a lot of other fruits do in tropical environments. Think of figs. Or I remember going to John's garden in Australia, and he had 6-year-old tomato plants. Well, here in England, the tomatoes grow and they die, right? So now Noah's having to collect all these and preserve them in some way. So you're producing alcohol. If you're producing large amounts of sugar and you're bottling large amounts of this, grape juice, it's going to produce large amounts of very high concentrate alcohol. And so, it's all speculation, but you can still kind of see how you could get to that degeneration, which wouldn't have been there before because it wasn't necessary to mass produce this volume of grapes or wine or whatever before. So,
Yep.
few thoughts.